Hello, welcome to Lecture 4, Health and Safety in the Costume Shop. Today we're going to talk a little bit about not necessarily things that you're going to handle specifically in the costume shop, but the types of things that you could handle, especially in the larger shop. These aren't things you're necessarily going to come in contact with here, but if we are going to handle anything in the shop that could be potentially hazardous, it's most likely going to be chemicals. So we're going to talk a little bit about chemicals in general, how they can affect you, how you can get them into your system, and then how you can protect yourself from them. The scene shop, the health and safety is focused a lot more on equipment because there's equipment there that can be very challenging and dangerous. The most dangerous or potentially hazardous equipment we're going to have in the costume shop is probably the iron. You want to be very careful with the iron because it has that very heated surface and you can burn yourself. So just keep hold of the handle. Make sure you return the iron to its proper place. And at the end of the day, whenever you're done using it, make sure not only is it turned off, but unplug it just for that extra layer of security. We also will use some very sharp shears or rotary cutters, possibly occasionally an electric knife. So there could be the possibility of maybe cutting yourself. So you just want to handle those things very carefully. You want to cut away from yourself at all times, and you want to make sure that your hands or any other body parts are not in front of whatever you're cutting. You don't want to hold something here and cut toward your hand. Keep your hand back into the side and cut away. Those practices will be a little bit more evident as we start doing some tutorials and demonstrations. So as far as equipment is concerned, those are the potential hazards. Some people have occasionally sewn through their fingers or their fingernails on a sewing machine. It happens very rarely because you have a foot there. The machine will generally stop. It's hard to get your finger underneath that. That happens a lot more with industrial sewing machines because you're going so quickly and so fast, and they're designed to handle higher volume and heavier goods. So it's pretty rare to get that to happen on a commercial machine unless you've got really long nails, and sometimes you could catch your nails. And that's a matter of just being conscious and aware of your hand placement and moving slow and steady with the machine until you get very comfortable with it. So those are the potential hazards as far as equipment are concerned in the costume shop. So that's just some general tips and understanding of how to handle those. And we'll talk about I'll remind you of those safety precautions as we do demonstrations and use those. The biggest thing that I've been told in my career, which I was told by one of my graduate student faculty, is Bill Black from the University of Tennessee, who is a wonderful mentor of mine. He would always say, because he's the one who taught all of our construction and technology classes, he would always say, engage your brain before you engage your hands. Because if you stop and think what you're about to do, you're more likely to do it more safely and more effectively than if you just jump right into it and start going. Okay, so just take a few minutes before you start your project to think about your project and think through it, and that's going to help you be safe. It's going to help you be more efficient, and it's going to make the project itself be more enjoyable because you've thought about it ahead of time instead of just going and encountering issues as you go. So engage your brain before you engage your hands. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about chemicals, because that's, again, other than those pieces of equipment, chemical exposure could be something that you would experience in the practice of costuming. You can avoid health issues by using safe practices. We're learning all about that in our current pandemic world, right? We're learning to wash our hands more often and how to properly wash our hands. We're learning about masking and the effectiveness of that, or not, as some people want to argue. But the idea of having personal protection and taking extra steps and extra precautions to keep yourself safe is becoming a lot more second nature to us. And that's just how we need to that's part of the engaging your brain before your hands philosophy. Now, and we'll address individual safety things with particular things as we get to them, but we're just going to talk about chemicals in general now. So hazardous chemicals, what can they do, right? They can affect your heart, your lungs, your liver, your brain, or your skin. Then it'll affect the way they perform. So it's really kind of what really toxic hazardous chemicals can affect your organs and their function, and affect your quality of life from that. So how do they hurt your body, right? The how mostly is between the amount of chemical you're exposed to and the time that you're exposed to it, right? If you need a small amount to cause a lot of problems, then that's going to be highly toxic. Okay. If you need higher doses of it, so you need, say a medium amount to affect you, that's going to be moderately toxic, right? And if there's little or no initial damage, but could be harmful with prolonged exposure. So if you need a high amount plus high time, then it's going to be mildly toxic. Okay. Now, the small and medium amount, of course, the less time. Again, the less time the exposure you have to exposure with the higher result, that also yields if it's highly or moderately toxic. And then the last quality is non-toxic. And non-toxic really just, that means that no matter how much you use, you should not have a negative effect from that. Okay. So that's how chemicals can hurt your body. The amount that you're exposed to and the amount of time you're exposed to it. There are some that you're exposed to a small amount, but you're exposed to it for a small enough amount of time, it may not affect you. But again, if it takes a small amount, it's highly toxic. So the time exposure becomes an issue as well. So a couple of other terms that you might see is the way that it kind of manifests, right? So so this is really mostly about amounts, but as far as time of exposure, if there's a way, so when there's dramatic immediate reaction, so if it happens right away, then it's an acute reaction. Now, and if you start to see damage over time, or if you see lingering effects, then that's considered chronic, right? So highly, moderately, or mildly toxic really kind of depends on the amount that it takes to cause an effect. Acute or chronic tends to deal with the amount of time exposure and how that affects you. So one of the other things that might happen is allergies. So you could be working with a mildly toxic or even a non-toxic substance, but you use it fairly frequently over time. Your body could start to build up an allergy to that. So that means that to you it's more toxic than it is to everyone else. So you also have to be aware that if something's listed as non-toxic or mildly toxic, if you have an allergy to that, then it automatically becomes moderately or highly toxic to you, right? So just because it's labeled that doesn't mean that it means that for you if you have an allergy or develop one. So that's something to be aware of as an individual. So latex is probably a really good example of that. Latex as a whole it's a natural kind of non-toxic substance unless you have an allergy to it, and then you're going to have an acute reaction, and it's going to be mildly to highly toxic to you. Okay, so that's just something to think about as well. So these labels only mean these labels for general public. You as an individual may have a different reaction. So chemicals that you have to be especially cautious of, and these should be labeled on anything that you get. Anything that's labeled a mutagen, that's going to affect your DNA. right? So that's going to change something on your DNA level, and then that can be passed on to another generation. So that's the thing to think about, and mutates your genes, a mutagen. Um, so you also want to look up for anything that's qualified as a tetragen. That if you're pregnant, and if you're pregnant, you have to be even more conscious of this because your system has a certain chemical balance that's affecting that fetus. So tetragens will affect fetal organ development. So you want to be aware of anything that might be labeled as a tetragen if you find that you're pregnant. Fetal toxins are also issues that will affect the growth and development of fetus at any stage. It could be very early as well. So that's just something to be aware of if you're a person who might be in a position where you could get pregnant. You want to be especially aware of anything that might be labeled a mutagen, a tetragen, or fetal toxin. One of the ways that you can learn about what these are is every chemical that's out there in the world should have a material data safety sheet that's provided by the manufacturer, and that should tell you everything about what's in it and how the safe practice of using that product is. For everything that we have in the costume shop, there is a label on this computer that is labeled MSDS, and you could look up the product that you're handling and you should be able to find the material data safety sheet. And frankly, in any shop you work with, scene shop, costume shop, mechanic shop, anything that has any type of chemicals or solvents or anything like that that you work with, should have material data safety sheets available to you. That's an OSHA rule. So if you're ever asked to work with something and you ask for a material data safety sheet and they don't provide it to you, then they're in the wrong. You have every right to know and understand things that you're handling and working with. So be aware of that. All right, so this is a little bit about kind of what chemicals can do. Now, how do they actually get into your system? So they can get into your respiratory system. They can get in through your skin, or they can be ingested. Okay, so respiratory means inhaled, so that's something you've inhaled through your nose or your mouth. Skin is something that's going to be absorbed through the skin, and then ingested is something that you actually get into your digestive system because you've eaten it. Or that it's an interesting thing we talk about in when I talk about makeup. The Food and Drug Administration, they also regulate makeup as part of the Drug Administration part and as part of the Food Administration part. Cosmetics are often, instead of just having a DA rating, a Drug Administration, they'll have the FDA rating, because especially lipstick and eye makeup, those points of contact, you basically eat your lipstick off. If you're wearing lipstick, it has to be edible. It may not taste good. It may not be nutritious, but it has to be safe for ingestion because it gets directly into your system that way. Same thing with eye makeup, because we've got that mucous membrane right there, and that liquid that makeup gets absorbed into and gets into your system. So you have to be aware of things like that with anything that you kind of handle. So for respiratory issues, that's inhaling dusts and vapors that can irritate your mucous membrane. Those are the membranes that line your respiratory system, your nose and your throat and lungs. The respiratory inhaled things can clog your lungs or interfere with your lung function, and they could even pass into the bloodstream and affect your organs. They'll most likely, if they get into your lungs, they can get into your bloodstream from there. And then sprays of all kinds in particular are the things you have to be concerned about with respiratory things to inhale. So mists and vapors, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are. But anything that you can inhale to your system. So as far as skin, the types of things that you're going to deal with that could affect your skin would be caustics. Caustics are things that kind of break down things chemically. Acids or solvents. They break down bonding agents. Peroxides and bleaches can also damage skin. So you want to be especially careful with those types of chemicals. And if you have any cuts or abrasions on your hands, then that allows those to kind of get into your system much faster and easier, because then you're not waiting for it to absorb in your skin. It's immediately going into that little cut. And then, as far as things that get ingested, the most often is a hand-to-mouth transfer. You'll have something on your mouth and won't think about it, and you'll wipe your nose or scratch your lip or scratch your eye, and then it can get in that way. Um, and then another way is it could get coughed up from your mucous membrane system. So if you've inhaled something and your nose is clogged and you start coughing, you tend to cough up stuff. You're coughing up phlegm or mucus. And oftentimes we'll either kind of snort that back in, or if we cough and we don't have something to spit into, we might swallow that. So you might get it into your digestive system by way of your respiratory system. And then probably really the most common way is by eating or drinking while you're handling any of these substances. So if you're eating or smoking, we don't tend to smoke inside as much anymore, but if you're working on something and don't wash your hands, go outside and light up a cigarette, that's going right into your mouth, right? If you have a drink, an open container, even with a straw, if any of that has gotten in the air, it's gotten onto that container, and now you're ingesting it because it's gotten onto the straw or the mouth of that drink. Same thing if you have food out, if you're having some snacks. So it's not, so like I said, when we're sewing, we don't really want to eat around the stuff around the costumes because you don't want to spill on them and you don't want to have greasy things on your hands, because most of the time we're not dealing with some of these things. But if you are dealing with chemicals in any way, which we tend to do more in the craft area or in hair and makeup, then you don't want to have that out because you don't want those chemicals to get into your food and then be digested. Okay. All right. So this is how they get into your system. Right? Now, how can you keep them out? Because the best way to protect yourself is to keep things out of your system. Well, for ingestion, don't eat, drink, or smoke while you're handling any chemicals, solvents, etc. For your skin, then you want to wear protective clothing. Wear gloves, wear lab coat, wear some type of smock or cover-up, an apron. You can wear face shields, you can wear masks, you can have head coverings, you can have a footed coverall that you zip over everything, right? So that's how for skin you're going to have that something to cover to create a barrier between whatever that is and your skin itself. And the more complex one is to protect your respiratory system. For your respiratory system, there are several different things that, as I mentioned, anything, we talk about dust and vapors primarily, but there could be gases. Gases are very rapidly moving particles, so they're they're breathed in much more, inhaled much more quickly, and they can go further because they're kind of smaller, moving around. There's vapors. Vapors are similar to a gas, but they're rising off of a liquid. So gas is just kind of in the air. Vapors are a gaseous substance rising off a liquid. There are also mists. Mists and fumes are similar. Not similar. Mists and fumes mists are liquid droplets in the air. Fumes have molecules suspended in the air, so it's much finer. It's closer to a gas, but it's not quite as light, and the molecules aren't moving as quickly. And then dusts means there are particles suspended in the air, so that's when you have actual physical particles and particulates. Smoke is a mix of most of these, right? So if something gets burned, then you have the particulates and the dust part to create the dust from what's being burned. You're gonna have vapors, especially if whatever's burning has some type of, it liquefies as part of the burning process. It's going to create vapors. As they get into the air, you're going to have fumes that will then also become gases, right? So burning things is that's where you're going to be exposed to a lot of those kind of things. One of the interesting things about that is the best way to discover what kind of fibers are in a fabric you're using is a burn test, but it's a very small amount. We'll talk about that when we get to fibers and fabrics and how that works. So those are the ways that those are the different forms that something can get into your respiratory system. And the number one way to keep them out is to have adequate ventilation. And there are multiple kinds of ventilation, right? So there's personal, there's room ventilation. So we'll talk about some of those different ones. So the ventilation, there's passive, and there's active. So active removal of substances from the air can be a local exhaust ventilation system. So that's just one area in the room. There's specifically a ventilation system that's actively pulling the air out from that area. There could be a hood surrounding the workspace. You may have seen this like in a chemistry lab. It's a large kind of metal structure that's directly over a workspace, and then there's active ventilation pulling any fumes or particles or vapors up through there. And then you're going to have ductwork to carry that contaminated air away. And then there's an air cleaner to filter the air before it's released, ideally before it goes into another room or out into the world. So that's part of that kind of system. You need a fan to pull the air through the system, because just because it gets removed from the room doesn't mean it gets all the way through the ductwork to the filter. An example of this, of all this coming together, is a spray booth. A spray booth, you can have a small kind of local one. It's usually about the size of maybe like a very tall set of double doors, but then it's probably going to be 3 to 4 feet deep. And so that has all of these components. It's got your local exhaust, and it's got the hood, so it's got everything contained for you to spray in it. And then it's pulling the air away, and it's going through the ductwork, and it's getting filtered before it gets released. But there are spray booths that could be like a whole room, and that's really great because you just walk into the room, you flip on the thing, you do whatever you're doing with any solvent, chemical, spray right there, and it's being pulled away from you through that system. And this is preferable to moderate to highly toxic substances, so you should not use those if you don't have access to an active ventilation system. And that's one of the reasons we don't really use those types of substances here, is because we don't have a spray booth. So then the option is to use something that's less toxic, clearly. So the best way to deal with that, have ventilation to protect yourself, is to have the active removal of substance from the air with something like a spray booth. Another option is a dilution ventilation system. So that basically, it helps to hinder the toxicity by diluting the substance. So there could be clean air mixing with contaminated air, and fans help draw it away, so it reduces the toxicity because there's just less of it in the air. Mildly toxic or very small amounts, and very small amounts of moderate to highly toxic, so you can use a combination of them. So if you are using some non or moderately toxic substances that can combine with the others, then you're reducing the amount you're exposed to, and that's going to help with that. So that's part of the dilution thing. This isn't adequate for mists and sprays, highly toxic or flammable vapors, because diluting those, it's really hard to dilute them because they're already fine and in the air, so you can't really dilute them much further. So if it's highly toxic or moderate and it's in the form of a mist or spray, then the dilution system isn't going to work. Another option, which is the one that we tend to use the most in our shop, is to have substitutions. And that's basically use a less harmful substance whenever possible. So if we've got a choice between 2 different dyes, for example, and one of them is moderately to non-toxic, another one's highly toxic, then I'm going to choose to use the one that's moderately or non-toxic. Even though most likely the reason why some of the higher toxic things tend to get used is because they tend to produce much better results. But if you're endangering your workforce, then you got to weigh that against the results you're getting. So, and it's not even about exposing your workforce. Say I want to use this aniline dye, for example, which is a highly toxic dye that gives these amazing, beautiful, brilliant colors. It's not that I can't use it. It's that if I'm going to use it, I need to invest in the protection that is necessary for that. So it tends to be, you tend to have a longer lead time, and you tend to have to invest in more better safety equipment protocols to use those substances. We don't always have the means to invest in that, which is one of the reasons why it's better to use the non or moderately toxic choice. And you want to And one of the ways that you determine how you can substitute is you've got to educate yourself on what you're using. You need to read the labels, and if the products aren't adequately labeled, you don't use them because you don't know what's in them. So read those labels, do some research, what one works best, what's giving you the results you want, and then of those, which one is the least harmful, the least toxic, and therefore is going to be the kind of more user-friendly option. And again, those material data safety sheets, those are very much your friend in that process. And as I said, you should always have access to them. And if you don't, make them get you access. So some of the other things, we're talking about aerosols and things like that. One of the other things that you could possibly encounter are solvents and more likely dyes. Solvents, like I said, solvents and dye tend to be the more toxic, potentially more toxic things that you would encounter, because solvents are made to dissolve an adhesive bond. So if you have some things that have been glued together with a particularly strong adhesive and you need those things to not be glued together anymore, you're going to have to use the solvent that's the one you need for that adhesive. And depending on what the adhesive is, and sometimes those adhesives themselves can be very toxic. So you want to make sure that you're using what you need to get the job done properly. And then of course you got to protect yourself as you're doing it. And dyes, again, some of the more brilliant saturated colors that you really want come from dyes that are more toxic. So you just got to kind of pay attention to that. You want to make sure that things that are flammable get stored in a flammable cabinet. Use your adequate protection and ventilation when necessary. And safer practices take longer. So if you determine that what you need for the job that you're doing does require one of these more kind of toxic substances, then you have to have a much longer lead time. You have to make sure that you plan out that you've got enough time to do it with all the safety protocols in place, so you aren't just jumping into it and not rushing through it, so then you're not tempted to skip any of those very crucial safety steps in order to get it done. So make sure you have adequate timing if you need to use some of these chemicals. Another thing that is a good investment if you work in costuming is a respirator. So a respirator is kind of a personal air filter, right? It's much more than just a mask. It has to cover your nose and your mouth, and it has to have a complete tight seal. So if you are someone with facial hair, you need to make sure that facial hair is removed in order to have that seal. You're going to have to get that fitted so that you can make sure that it fits your face completely and seals around your nose and your mouth. And then it's going to have 1 or 2 filter cartridges. And then whatever solvent or adhesive or chemical you're working with, you need to make sure you have the proper filter for that particular chemical, because they have different particles and they can be absorbed through different filters. So you have to make sure you have the correct one. You also want to store your respirator in an airtight, sealed place, because as long as that filter is exposed, that filter's working, right? And the filters will only be good for so long until they get saturated and have to be replaced. So those are all things about respirators, and most of them are just nose and mask. You can get a full face one that's, especially if you're working regularly with some of these chemicals and things, which if you work in a large scale craft shop for a very large well-funded theater, then it's possible you might be exposed to some of these things, because some of them because the results, again, can be very, very good. So you want to make sure that you invested in the proper equipment and that your company is investing in the proper equipment to help protect you. So that's a general overview of health and safety. What you mostly need to know about health and safety in the costume shop is engage your brain before your hands. Stop and think about what you're doing before you do it, and think about the best practices before you get things done. And just a little overview on kind of chemicals, because if you have hazardous materials in the costuming world, chances are it will be of a chemical nature. So that's what I have for you today. So thank you for listening to lecture number 4.